with neighborhood cookouts and concerts, block parties and art festivals. This is the weekend when communities around our nation are celebrating Juneteenth. Now, you might know this holiday got started in Texas on June 19th, 1865. What happened was Union Army General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston and announced the news: slavery is officially over. This sounds like something straight out of Isaiah, doesn't it? See, the Spirit of the Lord is upon you, and God has anointed you to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted and proclaim liberty to those who had been enslaved and release to the prisoners. You've got to tell them, says the Lord, freedom has come. Now, according to folk legend, even though the Emancipation Proclamation declared the end of Southern slavery way back in 1863, the news didn't travel to all the nooks and hollers of the Deep South. So even though slavery was pronounced over, not everybody knew. And here is a fact. You are not free until you know it. The folk legend claims that people in Galveston were unaware that slavery had ended, and maybe that's part of it. But it's also the case that General Granger's announcement was accompanied by Union soldiers who had come to enforce the new practice of paying wages for work. So certainly that had to help. Even with the presence of the army, though, you've got to wonder whether the people who had been enslaved were in any position to trust that this general was telling them the truth. I mean, they've been lied to before. How do they know this is not a trap? What if the whole thing is fake news? I imagine that they had to be asking each other the question that can only be answered by courage. How can we be so sure? As it turns out, the Emancipation Proclamation was not a lie. The work of ending slavery really was beginning. But it's also true that slavery was not obliterated all at once. Even after the first Juneteenth in 1865, slavery was still legal in Kentucky and Delaware. Even after the ratification of the 13th Amendment, slavery is still legal in the United States when it's imposed as punishment for crime. Even after the Civil Rights Movement, even to this day, signature practices of slavery are still in effect. So it is simply not the case that slavery is over in the United States. And here's the thing. People celebrating Juneteenth this weekend absolutely know that. Nobody is being fooled. We are not celebrating Juneteenth because slavery is all the way over. We're celebrating because we choose to believe the promise of liberation will be fulfilled one day. When you think about it, this is what Juneteenth has in common with our faith. We know what it is to go out and crane our necks and catch just a glimpse of what God is imagining for the world. And once you do that, don't say I didn't warn you when some of God's dreaming goes and gets into your dreaming. anybody can believe what has already happened. That's just relying on verifiable data, and that's not that hard. Choosing to believe in a promise that is still fragile and brave, that is something else entirely. When we choose to celebrate the end of slavery, what we're doing is making the end of slavery that much more possible. We are giving our power to the promise of God. Now, chances are, the story that Georgia read for us this morning came into being in order to answer a question. And the way I like to imagine it is that there was an ancient gaggle of grandchildren who were asking their grandmother the same question we're all wanting to know. How can we be so sure? You told us when God looked at the world and saw the violence of the human people that broke God's heart, it made God cry. You told us God decided to exterminate every living creature except for those refugees on the ark. So the next time God goes and gets upset, how can we be so sure she won't do this again? It's a good question. This is when the grandma leans back in her chair and crinkles her face like she does when she's thinking. You're right, she tells them. It's not like the people have done anything to deserve this. In this story, it's not the people who turn away from violence. It's God. It's as though God regrets drowning all of creation. It's as though this also made God cry. So God blessed Noah and his family and gave them new laws to walk in. Then God announced the promise to every breathing creature, to every person, every platypus, every porcupine, every pelican. I will never wipe out the world again, says the Lord. I am choosing a new path. But these kids don't miss a beat. How can we believe God this time? And you and I know they are not wrong to ask. We know there are people who abuse their partners who promise, I will never hit you again, only to do exactly that or worse. We know there are people dealing with addiction who promise, I'm clean now, I will never use again, only to relapse. And maybe their promises were disingenuous from the start, or maybe the people really tried to keep them and just couldn't. But either way, we know what it is to believe in a promise only to have it get broken. So how can we be so sure? And what the grandmother could have told those children is, we can't. We really can't be so sure. We are not in charge of God's choices. But it could be that faith is something more than being sure. Faith is going out and craning our necks in order to catch a glimpse of what God is dreaming for the world, only to see a shimmer of color that makes the Spirit of the Lord thrill in gladness, and then to see this same ribbon is shining in your soul too. It's as though what God desires in the heart of their heart is coming into harmony with exactly what you desire in your deepest heart. And it could be faith is choosing to believe in this dream while it's only fragile and brave. But the grandma doesn't say all that to the children. When the kids are pressing her, how can we be sure God will make good on his promise? She turns it back around. Oh yeah? When God says he'll never destroy the world again, what if he's right? What if he is exactly telling the truth? So what happened was the Lord our God handed over their weapon. They decommissioned their bow and hung it in the clouds with the blessing, never again. Now, anytime they see the rainbow, God will remember their intention. And anytime we see the rainbow and decide to believe it, you know what we're doing, right? We're giving our power to the promise of God. Now, these days in our world, there's rising interest in reimagining the work of policing. If you've been following the recent events of the Rock Island City Council, then you know this. Communities like ours are engaging in meaningful conversation about the purpose of police, and the church has a stake in this discussion. So around the nation, police departments are being challenged to do things like reevaluate appropriate use of force. Under the federal program 1033, police departments have been eligible to receive surplus military material that includes weapons designed for war. Well, in recent months, there's been an outcry to discontinue this program. And last summer, the United Church of Christ was a signatory on a letter to Congress urging this action, urging Congress to get rid of Program 1033. These days, reformers are calling for a rebalancing in police training so that more hours are devoted to strategies for de-escalation. In an article in the Harvard Political Review by David Gutierrez, on average, police departments require 60 hours of firearms training, 60, while offering only 8 hours of training in conflict mediation. So alongside equipping officers with skills and tools for nonviolence, there's also a push for police to collaborate with social workers and for communities to increase their mental health resources. The point is that when someone is in distress, now police will have more options than simply making an arrest. In some cities, law enforcement agencies are pursuing these initiatives on their own. I was excited to discover that last summer, the Moline Police Department reached out to the Center for Youth and Family Solutions in order to establish a partnership between Moline police officers and social workers in our own community. Of course, on the other hand, some of these reforms are being imposed on departments, like it or not. But either way, we can understand how heading down this path could seem risky for police. Now, there is no evidence that Program 1033 actually makes communities safer, but at the same time, it is a tall order to ask police departments to give up their weapons. Surely they've got to worry about how that will change their public perception. What if this makes them look weak? What if doing this makes them lose authority? The only thing is, what if exactly the opposite happens? And it could be this is where the church has something to offer, because we know choosing to disarm is not an act of defeat. It's an act of power. We know if police begin to claim peacemaking as their priority, well, that happens to be our mission too. And that puts us on the same team. We know authority is earned by trust, not by force. So when we see the police beginning to take steps toward nonviolence, imagine if that could earn and grow our trust. Imagine if the church could help foster these efforts. And so it is. Every Juneteenth celebration chips away at slavery and makes the promise of liberation that much more vivid. Every act of police reform that prioritizes compassion more than compliance, this makes the promise of peacemaking that much more clear and present. And you're right, it's true. We are not free from violence until we know it. But what if we know it? This is our faith. Every rainbow reminds the Lord our God that she doesn't have to wipe out the world again, because who knows? Maybe the people will turn away from their wickedness and learn how to set each other free. Maybe they'll see the rainbow too, and maybe this time we will believe it. May it be so.